Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 24th of December. Today we have some interesting updates, so let's start. First, we're going to start with the area we have the most interesting and the most important updates, and I'm talking about Bakhmut. Of course, I'm talking about Bakhmut. Today we received at least three interesting piece of news from this area. The first one comes from Yakovlevka, from this bridgehead, and the Russians reported that during the day there were very heavy clashes, but not in the vicinity of Yakovlevka or in the vicinity of Solidar. The Russians reported that during the day they were trying and made few attempts of storming Razdolovka, this town that located let's say on the north of Solidar, on the northwest from Yakovlevka, and on the west of the small town by the name of Vesele. And the Russians reported that they attacked the Ukrainian Foreign Legion or Foreign Volunteers in Razdolovka and 10th Mountain Assault Brigade in this area. And as a result of clashes in the vicinity of Razdolovka, the Ukrainians lost around 60 soldiers and something around 7 armored vehicles. If we return to the Western sources map, we have something about the same. As you can see, there is some icon around in the vicinity of Razdolovka. So the situation in this area is very interesting because yesterday there was an update from the Ukrainian sources that they managed to repulse the Russian attempt of attack in direction of Vesele, but there were no updates about the fact that this village, small village, was taken by the Russians. First, let's update this map according to the latest information we have. Yakovlevka is under Russian control, Belogorovka, Berestova, all these towns on the Russians, and today the Russians made few attempts in direction of Razdolovka. So the Russians, using the fields, were trying to attack, I believe, somewhere between Solidar and Razdolovka, or the Russians were trying to attack in the north of Vesele. So anyway, as you can see, as we discussed many videos ago, we can see and we can believe that maybe Razdolovka is the target of the Russians, and maybe these days we became witnesses of attack of the Russians in these directions. I believe that Vesele maybe is already under Russian control or is in the gray zone, but anyway, the Russians decided to pass through this town without establishing some position there, or they have already done this. So let's wait a little bit, and I believe that soon we're going to receive more updates about this territory. Furthermore, there are a lot of updates coming from Bakhmut, to be more precise, from the area near Podgorodnya. The Russians reported that during the day they stormed this area trying to take better positions, and they managed to do this in direction of Podgorodnya and the south of Podgorodnya. The Russians established control over 3 checkpoints, over 3 Ukrainian positions in this area. They haven't entered Podgorodnya yet. There are no Russians in this village, according to information we have, but they managed to establish control over these forests, over this road that connects gas station and Podgorodnya. So they got very close to this town, but they still haven't entered. But maybe while we're doing this video, while we're watching this video, maybe the Russians have already managed to enter this town. Anyway, let's update a little bit just to understand the real situation. So the Russians haven't entered Podgorodnya, but they have established control over some checkpoints that located on the south, and they got as close as possible, and like they already see the buildings right in front of them, we can say like this. Very interesting updates are coming from Klishchiivka, Andreevka, from this front line. If we return back to the Russian sources map, we see that the Russian source map has been updated. Now the Russians shows that they established control over the trenches and fortification that located on the west from Andreevka. It's like complete 100% control, and there are very heavy clashes in the south vicinity of Klishchiivka. The Russians stormed this area, but today we received another important update from this front line. Let's update first this map. This our Andreevka, so the Russians shows that they established control over this area, and they continue storming Klishchiivka from the south and from the north. Furthermore, there is an update about the fact that the Russians established control of the vicinity of the railroad station Klishchiivka. So the Russians attack from the south. To tell the truth, we saw the same updates yesterday and the day before yesterday. There is nothing new. More updates are coming from the area that located on the south, in the area from Dylivka, Dachna, and Druzhba, from these three towns. Some Russian sources are saying that during the previous 24 hours there were very heavy artillery preparation. The Russians, as you can see, there is an icon, 3 icons in this area showing that the Russians were attacking this area using artillery, aircrafts, and every single carrier that are able to launch missiles, rockets, and shells in direction of Belagorod, Dylivka, Dachna, and Druzhba, these 4 towns. And during the day we received, let's say, the first confirmation of the fact that the Russians made an attempt of storming operation in direction of Dylivka and in direction of Druzhba. And also during the day we got update that the Russians managed to enter the outskirts of this town. So I can't show you the real progress of the Russians in this area, but according to the information we have, I believe that the Russians managed to get as close as possible to this town. And if we're talking about village by the name of Druzhba, the Russians managed to enter some streets on some outskirts in the vicinity of this town. So this is the possible progress during the day, and this is very important because from the other side, if you take a look at this map, you see that the Russians attack and bombed New York. If we take a look at the Russian sources map, you're gonna see that a helicopter was shot down above in the area of Donetsk agglomeration. Furthermore, the Russians attack some kind of checkpoint of Ukrainians on this landfill. As you can see, this is like it's not just like a ground, it's like a landfill, and the Ukrainians had their eyes on this area, and the Russians attack and destroy their eye position in this area. Furthermore, the Russians storm from the south. So maybe these days we might see some kind of operation in direction of New York and Donetsk agglomeration. We discussed this operation for many times, and if you remember, I told you that in this area the Russians need to establish their line, or somewhere they need to take control over Dachna, Druzhba, and if they're able to do this, we discussed that with this operation the Russians will be able to establish fire control and maybe physical control over the road that connects Konstantinovka and Donetsk New York agglomeration. Furthermore, these days we also received some updates that were saying that the Russians made some kind of recon combat in direction of Alexandropol. So maybe we might see the encirclement or some kind of storm operation of New York agglomeration even earlier than Bakhmut. And we can understand why, because if we're talking about Bakhmut, we need to understand that Bakhmut has a lot of reserves, and not just inside reserves. They have a lot of outside reserves, and I'm talking about the road MO3, this one, and let's say the road that moves from Chasov Yar to the north, let's say this pass. So there are a lot of ways to supply and support Bakhmut, to move reserves, to move reinforcement, to do rotation process, and so on. And until the Russians take control over Solidar, Krasnaya Gora, Podgorodny, it's highly unlikely that the Russians will be able to develop progress in Bakhmut. But if we are talking about the south and Donetsk, New York, during the previous week, the Russians' attacks in this area was under the flag of Klishchiivka clashes, and we discussed this operation for many times. And the most important thing, we thought that the Russians are trying to take Klishchiivka just with one purpose, to establish fire control over the road that connects Chasov Yar and Bakhmut. But today I understand that the main goal of attack in direction of Klishchiivka was to develop the bridgehead along this canal, and the main purpose of that is to secure the Russian flanks in this area. And as I understand, the Russians managed to secure the flanks, and now they turned to the left and completely concentrated on the operation of taking Dylivka, Belaya Gora, Druzhba, and Dachna. So now the Russians have protected flank by securing Andreevka and Klishchiivka. As you can see, there are fields. The weather is not very good to attack the Russians, let's say, from the north and their flanks. Yes, they can use artillery, they can use a distant attack of tanks, but they can't send tanks or armored vehicles to attack the Russian flanks. So the Russians are pretty secured in this attack in direction of Belgorod. The only problems is artillery, but we know that Ukrainians have problems with artillery, and we know if the Ukrainian uses one shell against the Russians are able to answer with 6 or 7 shells, and it's a very nice argument to pin down and reduce the Ukrainian artillery activity. So the Russians do have possibilities, and they use these possibilities as well. So and I believe that this is not. We need to understand that the Russians, they don't have some certain plan. I'm trying to say that if the Russians are able, let's say, penetrate the Ukrainian defense orders in Bakhmut, they will try to develop. If they are able to penetrate the Ukrainian defense orders in Donetsk agglomeration, they will push there. So they push all over the front line. And there are a lot of armies, a lot of groups, a lot of forces. They're completely separated. Of course, they have some coordination, but every single army, every single group has their own targets. And we won't see something like if the Russians entered Bakhmut, that means that every single front line will be freezed until the Russians take control over Bakhmut, as we used to see, as we saw in Ukrainians' tactic. When the Ukrainians concentrated in Kherson, they stopped their activity on other front lines. When the Ukrainians were attacking Kharkov, they stopped any kind of activity on any other front line. If we're talking about the Russians, they are not planning to stop their activity anywhere, and if some front line has progress, it's just a benefit. It's just nice to see, it's just nice to hear, and they will continue their offensive operation on every single other front line, like Marinka, Vodyane, Ugledar, Kupiansk, Liman. And from this perspective, it's very difficult further for the Ukrainians. Furthermore, of course, it's nice to have some kind of collapsing of some certain front line from the Ukrainian side. I'm talking about, let's say, particular front line, or but as I understand, because of the fact that completely every single movement of the Russians can be seen by the Western intelligence, by the Ukrainians, I believe that from the Russians it is very important to keep speed, to keep collapsing of the Ukrainian front line all over the front line, but not at some particular place, because if front line collapses at some particular place like Bakhmut, in this case the Ukrainians are able to move reserves in this area. But if the front line collapses on the line from Avdiivka to Bakhmut, that means that Ukrainians won't be able to occupy this problem because they don't have reserve for these purposes. So the Russians' main goal to collapse the front line on a very big distance, but not on the particular front line as the Ukrainians tried to achieve during Ukrainian counteroffensive operations. So this is the reason that I believe that we will see not just the fall of Bakhmut, we will see the entire collapse of area from Seversk to Avdiivka. This situation gives the Russians a lot of opportunities, a lot of benefits, because in this case it will be very difficult for the Ukrainians to stabilize the front line further on the ground. Maybe they won't be able to stabilize the front line on the Slaviansk-Kramatorsk line. Everything might happen in this case. If we are moving to the south, to Donetsk, today there was very interesting updates from the south of Avdiivka. The Russians reported that civilians heard some kind of noise of battle, of the real clashes on the south of Avdiivka, on the south of this residential area somewhere here. We don't have any updates whether the Russians' offensive operation or there was some kind of fightings between Ukrainian forces in this area, because it's not a new thing, because we know that the Ukrainians adopted a lot of law, and now if Ukrainians decided to step back or retreat from their position without an order, they will go into jail for 12 years or something like this. Also, the Russians almost every single day reports about killing of those Ukrainians who refuses to follow the orders by their national battalions. So I won't be surprised if there was some clashes in Avdiivka between Ukrainians, because maybe some Ukrainians received an order to start offensive operation in Opitna, and maybe the Ukrainians were trying to return control, and some forces refused to follow the orders and they were just killed or something like this. I can't tell you, but I won't be surprised if there was a case of that in Avdiivka. If we're talking about Pesky, there are no progress on the ground. The Russians continue reducing the Ukrainians in this area, and if we're talking about this area, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around 40 soldiers and something around 10 armored vehicles. Today we got update that there was some kind of development on the south of Mariinka. You see an icon about this. But to tell the truth, this week we received an update from the same Russian source that they lost this checkpoint and they were forced to step back because of effective and counteroffensive operation of the Ukrainians. So I believe that today the Russians returned position they lost during the previous week because of because of weakness of Ukrainians in this area. I'm talking about like in global scope. So the Russians are finishing the operation in Mariinka. Today is 24th of December. I'm not sure that the Russians are able to complete this mission by the end of this year, but anyway, sooner or later they will do this, no matter the Ukrainian reserves in this area and so on. If we're talking about Zaporozhye, there were no updates in this area. There are clashes, the same stories with commandos and scouts, but without any real progress for both sides, for both parties. And today I believe that we need to discuss the Kupiansk-Liman front line. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukraine lost around 90 soldiers and something around 13 armored vehicles. And the thing is that today, if we are talking about Kupiansk-Liman front line, at least the Ukrainians talk like that. They're saying that there is, for them, if we're talking about regular soldier, if you ask the soldier of Ukrainians where, if he has a possibility to choose where to fight, and if you suggest Ukrainian soldier to decide to choose between Kupiansk, Liman or Bakhmut, these days the Ukrainians are saying that there are no differences between Kupiansk, Liman frontline and Bakhmut, because these two places like Bakhmut and Kupiansk, Liman is some kind of hell on earth, and the losses in Ukraine on the Ukrainian side are almost the same on these two front lines. So the Russians have been activated in this area as well. They're pushing the Ukrainians. Of course, they have their losses from their side as well, but we can consider the fact that the Ukrainians has a lot of loss in this area as well. If we are talking about North front line today, these days, we received some interesting updates from the Ukrainian side. As you can see, during the previous week, we received at least a few updates from Chernigov and Sumy region, from Kharkiv area, that the Russians started some kind of artillery preparation in the north of Kharkiv, in Sumy region and Chernigov. So we haven't received such active updates since, let's say, even May or March. We're talking about Chernigov and Sumy. We haven't received such updates from March of this year. If we're talking about Kharkiv, we haven't received such updates from September. But these days, we see that the Russians have activated on this front line. Maybe it's just a fake attacks trying to force the Ukrainians to keep reserves in the north of Ukraine, while their main attack in direction of Donetsk and New York, or maybe the Russians decided to start artillery preparation, and maybe these days we are going to see the Russian offensive operation in the north of Chernigov and Sumy region. Who knows? Who knows? If we're talking about Belarus today, the defense, the military authorities, Ukrainian military authorities reported that the Belarusian forces start movement of their tank and mechanized battalion, of 2 tanks and 1 mechanized battalion, in direction of Ukrainian border. Of course, we understand that this is not enough of forces to like to take even Chernihiv, because the north of Ukraine is completely fortified from the Ukrainian side. But anyway, it's a pressure on the Ukrainian side. They need to pay attention to this operation. They need to do some counter actions in this case. So maybe, because according to the Ukrainian sources, on the night from the 24th of December to 25th of December, according to the Ukrainian sources, the Russians were planning or are planning to start missile attack all over the Ukraine and start offensive operation on the north of Chernihiv and Sumy region. Who knows? So at least today, some part of the world are going to celebrate Christmas, and the Ukrainians will see another counter-offensive or another offensive operation on the north of Ukraine. Who knows? Anyway, we'll see this tomorrow in the morning. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds me to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.